This is the third video about what went on in my class today on February 23rd, 2021, since there is a group of students who were in a precautionary COVID self-quarantine, and I'm trying to make sure that they don't get behind, and the rest of the class had this information as part of an in-class lecture. The final thing that we went over in class today was we foreshadowed some stuff to come with the assignments that are going to be due on Thursday, February 25th. And so I want to kind of tie that up. So some additional comments. And these are comments about subgroups. The first one is an observation that I've already made once when we were looking explicitly at the Klein 4 group, but it has to do with associativity. Associativity is always going to be inherited from the larger group. In other words, what I mean by this is if G under, say, star is a group, and H is any subset of G, then the algebraic structure H under star, while it may or may not be closed, is always going to be associative. And the reason why is simple, and I do want to kind of look at that. So here's why. If I take H1, H2, and H3 from set H, well, H is a subset of G. So that means H1, H2, and H3 are inside the group G. And since G is a group, that means that H1 times H2 in parentheses times H3 is the same thing as H1 times parentheses H2 times H3. That is, and in all groups we have associativity. This is axiom 2. It's the associativity axiom. And consequently, we now can say, if we have any three elements, so any three elements of H, then I will know that the associative law is never going to be an issue. So when we're trying to show a particular subset is or is not a group, associativity is never going to be an issue. It will always be inherited. Now, and that's the language that we use to describe this, is inherited means that it's that simple. Now, there are two other observations that I also want to note, but these lead to theorems that we will prove in a later video. So, my first theorem is based on this. In all of the examples of subgroups that we have looked at so far, the identity element in the big group and the identity element in the smaller group were one and the same element. In other words, if H under times is a subgroup of G under times, then the identity element for H is going to be equal to the identity element for G. In other words, what this says in English is that the subgroup has the same identity element as the big group. And what this also means is that if I have a subset of a group G, and the group identity element does not belong to my subset, then the subset cannot be equal to a subgroup. And that's a very, very important way about thinking about proving something is not a subgroup. The second theorem deals with inverses. In all of the examples that we have seen, the inverse of a particular element winds up being part of the subgroup, if the element is part of the subgroup. So, in other words, if I have H is a subgroup of G, and I take any little h inside capital H, then the inverse for H inside the subgroup has to be equal to the inverse for H inside the big group. In other words, if little h is inside my subgroup, then little h has the same group inverse element inside H as it does inside the big group. And so if you've got a subset where you don't have all of the inverses inside the subset, then you know that you don't have a subgroup. So let me put that down as well. So if S is a subset of G, oops, let me clean up my handwriting, and little s belongs to capital S, and little s inverse does not belong to capital S, that's enough for me to conclude that capital S is not going to be a subgroup of the group G. And we will have you prove these theorems based on some additional videos in class the next time we meet.